So this week's Torah portion is a double portion, and it finishes off the book of Leviticus, which means next week is my bat mitzvah portion. Very exciting. Um, so Behar-Behukotai starts off with the laws of the Shemitah and Jubilee years, when all of the land in the land of Israel gets a break. So every 7 years, um, you don't work your farmland and you just let the fruit drop, but people can still come and take what drops, but you just aren't supposed to cultivate it in any way. Let the land lie fallow for a year. It's good for soil regeneration as well. Not that I don't think they knew about soil regeneration much, but or at least not the chemical side of it. But God knew. So those laws come up here. And then every 7 sets of 7 years, so every 49th year, or I think actually it's the 50th year, so after 7 sets of 7 years is the Jubilee year. Just like we count 49, 7 weeks between Pesach and Shavuot, and then Shavuot is the 50th day. So it's like that. Jubilee, then not only does the land lie fallow, but all of the land reverts to their original owners, and debts are forgiven, loans are forgiven, slaves are set free, etc. That became a pretty intensive place for rabbinic law because of because then we get into issues of like, well, if you have to forgive your debts every 49 years, then like in that last few years before you, if you know the Jubilee's coming, then nobody's going to give out loans because they're not going to be repaid. And so you get into issues like that the rabbis were concerned about, how that would be dealt with, even though mostly the rabbis of the Talmud didn't actually live in that land. But about half the rabbis of the Talmud didn't live in that land. Anyway, so then the Torah continues, but don't worry, you can, if you do this, God will grant you such abundant harvest that you will have plenty to eat, like to store up and ration for yourself during the years that you can't harvest. And so some laws continue above that. There are different approaches to these laws in walled cities and unwalled cities, which we see crop up a few times throughout the Tanakh, especially not in the Torah, but like later when we actually are in the land and are settled and can build cities. And so there's a difference in how people behave if you live in a protected city versus in the boondocks. There are some laws regarding how to treat Jewish slaves. It's a little, uncomfortable because of the distinction between Jewish slaves and non-Jewish slaves, and that our people were enslaving people at all after having just been freed from slavery. But again, for its time, it was relatively progressive. And then and a reminder to observe Shabbat. We get a lot of those throughout the Torah. And then it sort of shifts to, if you do all these things, it's more specific than just like, don't worry, you'll have something to eat in the Shemitah and Jubilee years. Then it gets more specifically, if you observe all my commandments and do as I tell you, then I will send the rains, your ground will be fertile, your people will be fertile, like all of the good things that ancient peoples were concerned about, those things will happen. If you don't follow my commandments, I will curse you, and all of your women will be barren, and your your soil will be as copper, like nothing will grow in it, and you will have hardship. Um, then there's like a weird discussion of if you offer. Okay, so it's part of a broader section about giving to the temple besides just, your own sacrifices or your required tithes, your shekels. But if you wish to give into like the temple coffers beyond that. So that makes sense. Great, let's have those rules. But then there's like specifically a few verses about if you wanted to give the value of a person, here's what each person is worth. And I think it's like a reference to like, based on the policy of like redeeming the firstborn, or like again that they were shifting from other ancient Near Eastern cultures around them that did actually physically sacrifice people. And so like we don't do that, but here's like what you can give to the temple in monetary value that like is comparable to that spiritual effort of like sacrificing this person. But it's I don't know, that's a strange concept to me, and how they decide who's worth what. And I mean, it kind of makes sense for their time. Like a man of conscription age is worth the most, a woman is worth less, a child is worth less, like, but it's still a strange concept. um and then that's pretty much where it ends. Then we talk a little bit more about specifically tithes, which are not just donations, but something that you are required to bring to the temple. Um, and then that's a summary. So, was there anything in particular that caught your eye, or any place you wanted to start? Yeah, Dave.
I didn't really, first, can you hear me? Because I'm using my iPad today.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I didn't really follow most of the stuff at the beginning of Behar. See if I can find in fact, I was confused through much of it, of the Jubilee and the whole business of redemption. So roundabout, I got the walled city, so that if you were in a walled city, the house, unless it was a Levite city, then it stayed with the person who had the deed, presumably. But what I didn't get was I didn't get the starting about verse 26, 27, I guess 27, about counting the years of the sale thereof and restoring the overplus unto the man to whom he sold it, but he shall have returned unto his possession. I read that about 6 times, and I still don't think I have a clue what they were talking about. I thought, at the Jubilee, I own this piece of property, but it was yours or your family's. At the end of that, it's yours. I don't know where I go or what happens to me, but it's yours. But apparently there's something else, some other conditions, or am I misinterpreting that?
I think these other conditions refer more toward like um how you compensate the person who's being displaced when the land goes back to you, or how they can continue to rent it from you, or it's like, so how long has it been since like how long has this other family lived on it, makes a difference in how it gets returned to the original assigned people. And so something I find really helpful in understanding these verses, because they're kind of complicated and they're so theoretical, right? Like this is God telling you what you're going to do when you enter the land. Um, and we see very little of it in practice. But in Jeremiah, there is a little hint of how this worked in practice that I find um, like I find really helpful because it does show it a little bit more rooted, grounded in something like reality, um, where the there Jeremiah knows that the expulsion is coming, um, but also the Jubilee year is coming, and so he needs to like get the deed to his family's land um before the expulsion, so that when they come back he has evidence of this is his land, regardless of who else is living there in the meantime, that like when the Jubilee comes it defaults to his clan, and he has to like send his scribe to go to his uncle to get it written out, so that it's not necessarily, it doesn't even necessarily have to be the same person that re-inherits it after the 50 years. It's like the family or the clan, the rightful inheritor. um so it was a means of maintaining the boundaries as given by God, which I think those boundaries are given later. We haven't seen them yet in the Torah, but God says like this is where this tribe will live, and this is where this tribe will live, and this is where this tribe will live. But as people marry and integrate and whatever, there can be some shuffling between the tribes and the land assignments. And part of the Jubilee practice is to like remind us that this isn't just a plot of land that we get to like treat however we want and live on however we want. This is God's land assigned to the Israelites, and specific parts of the land are assigned to specific populations of the Israelites. And so it's important that it, resets accordingly every so often.
So is that the Haftorah from Behar? Jeremiah 33,
Um,
which I have to confess I did not read. 32, sorry.
hold on, let me look. Um, how do I get back into explore the library? Haftarah. No, the Haftarah for this parsha is a slightly earlier part of Jeremiah.
Okay.
That has more to do with the aspect of like if you follow the rules, you have good fertile land. If you don't, you are cursed.
Okay. So those of us who are dispossessed of our land, where do we go?
Like if you were the person who had bought the land from the rightful owner,
Yeah.
You go back to your family's holdings. And if you don't have ancestral family holdings, then you have to rent from somebody else. Like if you're a convert or something, then you don't really get secure housing.
Got it.
Um,
Okay.
so to this day in Israel, you don't buy property, or a person can't buy property. You you lease, and you can have very long-term leases. It's not like here where it's like a year at a time or whatever. You can rent for a generation, but it's you know, the state reserves the right to reclaim it at any time because it's God's land. When I was there, our kibbutz had to renew their lease, and it was like a whole thing. Like, you know, they were reaching their 50th anniversary, and so it was time to renew their lease on the plot of land.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, the Shemitah is it's full of interesting things. I often am very struck by oh, I'm looking at the wrong page. I'm on Jeremiah still. Um, I often am particularly struck by the agricultural aspect and how smart it is, you know, for a culture without science to be aware of the necessity of letting land rest and everything. I mean, at some level, I guess that sounds patronizing because they lived off the land. Of course, they knew how land worked, but they didn't, you know, again, like they didn't understand the like chemistry aspect of the soil and why that makes sense and the things that we know now. But they did it, they knew to do it, and they saw it as a divine decree because it worked. Like you let the land lie fallow every so often, it regenerates the nutrients in the soil, you have better crops. And now, you know, we do have that science that explains why like letting land lie fallow, or at least like crop rotation, is really important for soil nutrient regeneration. And yet we don't do that. Like so much of our farmland in this country is monoculture, and we depend on um, you know, chemical fertilizers to keep the soil nutritious because we just can't be bothered to engage in, you know, ancient practices that have proved themselves agriculturally sound for years because corn makes more money, so we're just going to grow corn. um, but another facet of the parsha that again, it's like a little complicated how it would work in practice, but I think the lesson is really important, is this, you know, this idea of jubilee in how like how we relate to property and how we relate to each other, and letting our slaves go free and letting debts be forgiven, that you cannot really inherit generational wealth. I mean, except for the, to some degree you still do because the land reverts to the original clans as assigned by God, but you can't like increase the profit value of that plot of land and then, you know, flip it or whatever. Like you can't continue to grow generational wealth and, you know, pass it down while others continue to grow in generational poverty and dig themselves deeper and deeper into debt, as we see in our current society. You know, there's this reset button that helps keep everybody relatively equal, from generation to generation. That is, you know, radical and worthwhile to examine how we would reimagine that in a modern context. That's what I think. Um, one of our more recent bat mitzvah students had this parsha, and I'm trying to remember what the lesson she gleaned out of it, because sometimes that's the most interesting um, ways to look at Torah, is what people who are seeing it with fresh eyes are learning from it. I can't remember. I just remember she really liked the word oivechem. It comes up a few times in the Behukotai section. Um, that your enemies will pursue you. I will send, I won't protect you from enemies. And the idea that enemies are oivim was really funny to her. But I don't know if that's where oive comes from. I didn't have an answer to that, but I have to assume they're related. Did other things that strike you, or you guys are quiet today? Yeah, Chava.
Who keeps track of what years we're in?
That is a good question. We don't really anymore. I guess somebody keeps track of Shemitah because they do. Like we do know when it's Shemitah year. I don't know if that's been like steadily kept for all of diaspora, or if that's something that restarted in 48. But like, I know when it is a Shemitah year, the Jews on the internet post about it, and like the land of Israel has to. I've mentioned this before. The land of Israel has to observe it, and the country, the manufacturers, the Jewish manufacturers in the country, do things like they sell the deed to the land to a non-Jewish farmer for the year or whatever, similar to how people sell their chametz, their non-perishable pasta and whatever for the week of Passover, and then take it back at the end. Like you just claim you don't own it, and then you can continue to work the land and make your money. But so they do still observe it. Jubilee, we don't. We have lost track of. I do know that. But yeah, and I don't know how it was handled in antiquity, especially with people having, on average, lower lifespans. Like to remember when 50 years have gone by, and what counted as a year for them, because they didn't have a calendar that we are familiar with now. Even the Hebrew calendar, which like some of those months are referenced in the Torah, so we know the calendar we have is based on something that goes way, way back to Torah times. But really it was, Hillel the Elder, or Hillel too. One of the Hillels in the early Mishnaic times instituted the Hebrew calendar as we know it today. So that's, 2,000 years after what we're reading right now. So I don't know how they calculated what was a year and who kept track of it and how they kept track of 50 years. I'm not really sure.
I think somebody could come up with a formula that could solve the equation.
For us to answer that now, or like somebody at the time would have come up with a formula?
Nowadays, someone could translate the way
Maybe.
the calendar works into a formula with computers and all.
I just feel like there's missing variables because we don't know, I guess, like when it started. You know what I mean? Like to count, unless we just started fresh now, or started from 48, with Jews re-inhabiting in a formal sense. Jews lived in the land all along, but, if we start with the Jewish state and then count 50 from there, the Jubilee years. Is that? I don't know. What kind of formula are you thinking? You'd like to,
Well, they're, I don't know, 28 days in a moon month.
right.
And then, when, I don't know how many moon months you get before, I don't know, what is a year on a lunar calendar?
Well, that's what
But
I'm saying. I mean, now we have, um, it's what, 10 months, except when there's a leap month, um, which also is its own cycle that is very hard to keep track of because it's not just like every 4 years, but there's a 17-year cycle, and it goes like every 2 years, every 4 years, every 2 years, every 7 years. I don't know. There's like a whole, it's very hard to keep track of. As someone who's not good at numbers or really the passage of time in general, keeping track of a 17-year cycle, that's not a consistent interval. Yeah, Joel.
Yeah, so of course it's arranged that we have 7 times every 19 years. We intercalate, means we add in 1 extra month ad arbeit. So how that works out in practicality, if you only go by the moon, there's 354 days to a year instead of 365. And of course the Muslim calendar, the Islam, they follow the lunar calendar. Practically speaking, what that means is Ramadan keeps slipping into the past. And if you have 2 guys both sitting side by side and they have the exact same birthday, and the American guy says, "Oh, I'm 33 years old today," the Muslim guy is only 32 because their year is of a different length. And of course, ours is the correct one because it works out fine.
Well, correct is a,
No, it is because we want to keep our holidays in track.
right. So it's correct for us.
So
It's
as
a subjective term.
Exodus chapter 12, verse 2, you shall appoint the new moon, blah, blah, blah. So, no, it is correct because even in Christendom, what happened was they started to notice that Christmas kept slipping, and it was like March, April before they're getting around to the birthday. And they said, "Oh my God, something is terribly wrong."
December's not the birthday anyway.
Yes, correct.
That was a date chosen to usurp pagan solstices.
Anyway,
So
yeah.
whatever.
But here's something interesting. I noticed last week when we were reading Leviticus 23:3, it starts off Yom HaShvi'i Shabbat Shabbaton. Yom means day, Shvi'i means 7th. So the 7th day shall be a complete rest for you. And we call that Shabbat. And I notice that that's a parallel verse to what we read this week. This week says Shana Shavi'it. That's the 7th year. Shana means year, and it's a Shabbat Shabbaton. So I think it puts in people's minds the idea, I understand a day of rest for us. You can't work 365 days a year. It's no good. But the land, we're making a parallel. And of course, they're introducing the idea the land belongs to God. And just this morning, I was staring at some Hebrew words, and the Hebrew words are Kain Yahi Ratzon. Anyone catch on to that? You know what I'm talking about? Kain Yahi Ratzon?
What, that it appears in the text?
In our
In the
liturgy.
Torah? Oh, our liturgy, yeah.
And we were always saying that. It's may it be his will. It's like saying Amen. Can you hear Ratzon? A lot of prayers. I was looking at the word Ratzon. Reish, Sadi, Vav, Nun. And the two the two letters, the two Hebrew letters, Radi, Reish, Sadi, are the same letters as in the word Eretz. Eretz means land. We say Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. And I said, wait a minute, this is really profound. It's really saying that the land, the Eretz, is God's will. Oh my God, this is what we're reading about. So of course I immediately go back to all my dictionaries and I could not match it up. And I
Yeah,
said,
those
oh,
aren't the same root, but that is clever.
it is. I'll tell you why. Because I searched further and I found in Bereshit Rabbah. And I'll send you the link later, Rabbi.
Okay.
I have it in my notebook and I was certain to copy it down. What that says is someone, that particular document, Bereshit Rabbah, is from the year 500. It's like
Mhm.
1500 years ago. And here's one of our sages coming up with that same conclusion. So I trust the sage. What do you think, Rabbi Goldstein?
Well, I think the sages love to do things like that to help it expand their understandings of the text. That doesn't mean it's the same root, but it is a clever drash that adds to our appreciation of the words.
Well, I also was checking the grammar. We're too far into the weeds. This isn't that interesting, but I was checking how our grammar adds the letter aleph, and apparently there's a tradition for that. So if I take the word ratzah and I put the aleph on the front, that makes eretz. And so I'm
Right.
still on track. I'll let you know later,
Okay.
in 12 years or so, when I figure it out.
Okay. Um, okay. Let's back to Torah. Does anybody have something to say about, you know, the text itself? Um, I I was trying to think about, I haven't gotten very far in this thought practice, but maybe you guys can help me. So this week, Sunday, of course, is Mother's Day. So Friday night is our sisterhood Shabbat. Um, and I was trying to think of something, some drash on this parsha uh, related to women, mothers, sisters, nurturers, women of the Bible, something. But there's not really people in this parsha. It's just God giving laws. So I got a little stuck on that. I'm not sure if anybody has something they think they can nudge on that for me, with me. You can play here.
Well, there certainly is some fodder, if you will, in the second part of the portion, with women being very definitely undervalued in comparison to men.
Yeah, that's true. But even that, like I said, there's part of me that, wants to connect this to like the wage gap. But the primary person in this time is very clearly someone that they view as a warrior, like someone who can fight and defend them against enemies. And so, even it's not even all men, it's men of a very specific age as well. Now I'm trying to find that. I scrolled up too far. I lost. Oh, here we go. Chapter 27. When anyone explicitly vows to the Lord the equivalent of a human being, it's like already, such a weird. Um, God hasn't like presented this uh, possibility before. We haven't talked about vowing an equivalent value of a person, like to even put this in people's minds. But in case you were wondering, here's what people are worth. Very strange. But anyway,
What if it just means like that's how far they bent down?
what?
Like when they vowed the equivalent of a human, like that's how far they bent down.
No, not bow, vow.
Oh, vow, sorry.
Yeah. And then it gives monetary values. A male from 20 to 60 is 50 shekels. A female, which I assume they mean also female between 60 and 50, is 30 shekels. A person from 5 to 20 is 20 shekels. Oh no, it does give a breakdown. Yeah, 20 for a male and 10 for a female. Under 5, 5 for a male and 3 for a female. And over 60, 15 for a male and 10 for a female. So the gap, well, I don't know. I'm not good at math. Joel, you're our numbers guy. Do the percentages, do those continue to,
No.
they're not the same difference between male and female for all the age groups, are they?
Hmm.
50 and 30, 20 and 10. No, that's half. That math I can do. The others are not half. 5 and 3, 15 and 10. So I don't know. We're off my initial question, but now I'm wondering about that. How do you think they calculate this? Beyond the like obvious of whatever, that a person in their prime age is worth the most, that men are worth more than women, blah blah blah. But like even the difference as they go down, the difference between men and women in each age range isn't consistent. They just round. It's just we're like, these numbers look plausible.
Well, what I'd like to believe is that, the assignment of monetary value is different than intrinsic value. And
Yeah.
that maybe women are worth, less currency, but that's because we're doing so many other important things
Right.
that
I do
they're
think
so important that you can't place a value on it.
I certainly think that's what the rabbis would say, because they want to gloss over any difficulty. And I do agree that I don't think even the Torah itself is making the case that monetary value is the same as intrinsic value, like we talked about last week with the whole like eye for an eye thing. It's not like, or a life for a life. It's not like your eye is only worth X amount of dollars. Like to you, your eye is invaluable. Like how awful to lose an eye. You can't just make up for that with money. But if you lose work over it, then your eye is worth the amount of money that like losing it has lost you, you know? So I think that's the same kind of calculation they're doing here, right? Like the amount of output that was deemed, commercially valuable or whatever, um, is worth more money. And so, I mean, we still see this today with like not just men and women, but even in different types of careers, like domestic work is viewed as less valuable or less, at least, it's worth less financial compensation. Um, you know, teaching, cleaning, childcare, home care, those things are not paid as well as um, something that really puts you more out, I guess, in the commercial marketplace. Rashi's explanation. When people reach a venerable age, a woman's value becomes closer to that of a man. This is why a man decreases in value in his old age to beyond a third of his value, while a woman in her old age decreases to only one third of her value. Okay. As people say, an old man in the house is a breach in the house or a snare in the house. Do people say that? I don't know. I don't know that phrase. While an old woman in the house is a hidden treasure and a good sign for the house.
That's your
Okay.
drash for your group. That's beautiful.
Yeah. Well, certainly, given the age of most sisterhood members, I think that has particular value. Um, why is an old man a breach or a snare? Why do we think men's value decreases more than women? Irascible old curmudgeons. So I don't know if that's, well, okay. So what I'm also thinking about this explanation from Rashi and how it relates to our view of gender and age today is, I think on the whole, women's youth is valued more highly than men's youth, or like women are considered old at a much lower chronological age than men. So that like value, I don't think matches up, but I do agree. I think like in a household, like there does tend to be more admiration, I think, for older couples and things like that, and the fact that women typically outlive their husbands and are more likely to live longer as widows than men as widowers, I think is closer to this idea that a man in a house is a snare, but a woman is a hidden treasure.
I think maybe also that, the man's contribution would have been something that he could do more efficiently in his youth. So he's lifting heavy things. He's doing things that women physically might be more challenged to do. So as he ages, his output is going to be less because, he just can't lift as much. He can't endure as much in the field, let's say. But a woman, if she was doing domestic work and it was physically less challenging, then she's
Able to
going to be able
maintain a
to,
pretty similar
yeah.
output. Yeah.
And also after a woman hits menopause, right? So if she's if ancient woman was in a perpetual state of pregnancy because there wasn't any birth control, then she would have needed to take it easy some, more of the time. But after menopause, then, her body is able to perform more in line with what at least a man of the same age could perform.
It's true. Joel put another thing in the chat. With regard to valuations, the Gemara asks, what is different with regard to the female that when she ages past 60 years, she stands at a valuation of 10 shekels, 1/3 of her previous valuation of 30 shekels? And what is the difference with regard to a male that when he ages past 60, at which point he has a valuation of 15 shekels, he does not stand at even 1/3 of his previous valuation of 50 shekels? Hizkiah said that people say, a popular saying, if there is an elderly man in the home, there is a burden, as he does not help with anything. If there is an elderly woman in the home, there is a treasure, as she assists with various domestic labors. There you go. You just keep putting more things in the chat.
I think
Rabbi
it depends.
Yehuda was a close friend of Archimedes.
That's humor.
Oh, okay. I was like, that doesn't make sense.
I think it depends on the man and the woman.
Well, of course. But I
Some
think
men are quite helpful, and others worthless. And some women are fabulous cooks and make the home just a delight, and others are not a delight. So it depends.
of course. I think if we're talking about like this time period though, where all of the domestic labor was expected of the women while the men went out and worked, then the men don't, when the men retire, when they can no longer do that hard labor, they like,
It would be a burden.
yeah, they don't know, I don't know, can't teach an old dog new tricks. I mean, I'm sure some men back then too, like, did learn how to make bread or whatever, did help. But I think, I don't know.
Well, they entertained, told stories, educated the young children.
Yeah.
They'd find something to do. But those guys who are useless, no, they'd be just a burden. And as Joel pointed out, curmudgeonly.
Yeah. I know plenty of curmudgeonly old women too, though, to be honest.
The point of the next thing I put in chat is the guy wants to donate the weight of his arm in gold. And they said, how are we going to do that? And this Rabbi Yehuda said, very simple. You got a barrel of water. He sticks his arm in. We see how much water it displaces. Oh my God, that's stolen from Archimedes so clearly. So it's like almost like a formula. Very interesting.
I don't know anything about Archimedes or what that reference you're making is, but I mean, it seems like pretty good ancient mathematics, right? So, like how much a water displaces.
Archimedes was a friend of the king, and the goldsmith made a new crown for the king. And the king said, how do I know if this is pure gold or if it's been adulterated? How do I tell? And Archimedes was taking a bath that evening. It was Saturday. And as he got into the bathtub, he noticed that the water rose up in the bathtub. And he shouted out, Eureka. Eureka means I have found it in Greek. And the rest of the story goes, he jumped out of his bathtub and he's running up and down the street. He forgot to put his clothes on, shouting, Eureka, Eureka. So that's the classic story that they tell you when you're learning physics about the displacement of water, uh, roughly how a boat floats and things like that. But you can also use that to determine what we call the specific gravity of gold or any other metal. You see how
So
much,
what, so tell him what Archimedes told the king.
I don't remember that part. Do you have some information?
Yeah, he took the crown.
Yeah.
He said, how much gold did you give the goldsmith? And they took that amount and put it inside a container of water, measured the amount that was displaced. Then they took the crown, did the same thing. The displacement was not the same. The goldsmith did not come out well.
Okay.
Well, surely he deserves some payment for his labor.
He got something for stealing the king's gold that he did not want to have. You don't mess with
Okay.
kings. Joel's right. It was a great physics lesson.
Well, I just Googled Archimedes on the side. That was 400 years before Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. It's possible Rabbi Yehuda was aware of these basic physics principles, knew what he was doing. It's interesting that the Talmud, I think I mentioned this before too, because I just finished this tractate. They spend so much time on the shekel, on the the tithes and how you make your donations to the temple and all of that, even though there was no more temple treasury when they were writing, but it was very important to keep track of how you would, in theory, make your donations to the temple treasury. And I think for some people, for some communities, and that was um, the model for how you would donate to the Jewish community. If not the temple, but maybe the synagogue or the like the ghetto. In certain time periods when the Jews lived within a walled neighborhood within the walled city, walls within walls. Then you would have a similar method of tithing or whatever to keep again sort of inequality among the community and help just redistribute funds as needed and maintain the rabbi or the I don't know, ambassador is not the right word, but the person who then goes and talks to the king or the Gentile mayor or whatever whose city you live within. um you know so it's useful to us that they continue to write on these things, but it's funny to think about living in that time of upheaval and chaos and spending as much time discussing irrelevant laws for circumstances that don't exist anymore as much as they did discussing the current laws for creating their new circumstances. Like they did both in pretty equal measure. And um I don't know, maybe there was something grounding about still talking about the temple and not spending all of their time with, oh my God, what are we going to do next? We have no more temple. Um, I guess after this past year, I can sympathize with that. Any last comments before we wrap up? We're just about at 2 o'clock.
Well, I just was really impressed with the idea that you could do a reset of your civilization every 50 years. It just, it's so un-American, if you will, which just seems to be based on the profit motive, get as much as you can, as quick as you can. But the idea that, really a Native American idea, the land doesn't belong to us. You can't really buy and sell it. You get to use it and you have a responsibility to maintain it. I just found that a very radically different prospect, principle from what I've seen in my lifetime.
Yes, I agree.
Not that I know how you would relate that to a women's Sabbath, but
Well, women are certainly often disproportionately hit by capitalism. But I have a student who, separately from being my student, is also reading something about Marx and women, and how the socialists and the communists also had a bit of a sexism problem. So women are treated as a commodity inside and outside of capitalism, and even in a culture that claims there's no commodification of human life, still treats wombs as a commodity. So I don't know. I don't know how I would relate that back to the Jubilee year specifically, but I think there's a connection in how how much we have disconnected from those Torah concepts of equality and reset, and just being people living in the dirt. So maybe we can start to edge our way back there.
was that phrase you used, Joel? Key something ratzon?
Ken
Ki
Yehi
Yehi
Ratzon.
ratzon.
May it be so.
May it be God's will.
Yeah. All right. Have a good one, everyone. Next
Thank
week
you
back
very
to noon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Hi,
Bye.
thank you.